for God. It's Carolina. I'm a sophomore at MIT, and we're really glad to have you guys here with us. So this is the second talk of a six-part series happening on Tuesdays and Thursdays this month. And Reason for God is hosted by Crew at MIT, which is a student group that I'm involved in. And if you're from another campus, it's really awesome to have you here as well. Crew is a caring community where you can explore your faith or grow in your faith if you are already a Christian. And we host Reason for God in order to create a space where we can engage in some of the big questions about life and about God. At these events, we welcome people from a whole spectrum of beliefs, whether you're an atheist, a Christian, a member of another faith, whether you have lots of doubts, or if you've been hurt by religion, really no matter where you are, this is a space where we can be honest about what we think. Honest about questions and doubts, and a place where it's also okay to disagree with some of the things that you hear. If you disagree with the speaker says tonight, that is perfectly fine. All we ask is that we all be respectful and polite to one another during that disagreement. But before I introduce the speaker, let me just tell you about a couple of things that are going to happen tonight. We'll have some Q&A after our speaker gives his talk. And in the panel to the right of your screen, you should be able to see three columns: chat, participants, and Q&A. And you can submit questions in the Q&A section, and you can also upvote the questions that you like so that we know which ones are the most popular. And I'd like to say that we'd really like to prioritize hearing questions from students tonight. Of course, feel free to submit a question regardless of whether you're a student or not, but just be mindful of how many you're submitting, just because we want to make sure that everyone really has a chance, especially students, to ask questions to our speaker. And also, please make sure to look at other questions before you post one, because if you see a question that's really similar to yours, just go and upvote it instead so we avoid having too many duplicates. And we would kindly ask that you don't post your comments in the chat section. We'd like to just reserve that for official announcements. So if all of your questions could go in Q&A, that would be great. So in previous years, as some of you guys, if you've ever been to our events in person, would remember, we'd all be eating a dinner together in a big dining room. But for obvious reasons, we cannot do that this year. But instead, we'll be taking this opportunity to make a donation for everyone who's here to nonprofits that provide food for those in need. So thank you again all so much for being here. And just to mention, at our past session, we were able to give $380 to a local food pantry in Boston. So we're really excited that all of you guys are here this week and that we can continue to do that through this month. So now I'd like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Greg Gansel. Dr. Gansel is a professor of philosophy at Talbot School of Theology at Biola University. He's the author of several books, including A Reasonable God, Engaging the New Face of Atheism, and Thinking About God, and he's the editor of God and Time. In his most recent book, Our Deepest Desires, How the Christian Story Fulfills Human Aspirations, Dr. Gansel makes the case that only in the particular claims of the Christian faith our universal human aspirations can find fulfillment and our restless hearts will be at peace. Prior to teaching at Biola, Dr. Gansel was a senior fellow with the Rivendell Institute and was a lecturer at the Yale Philosophy Department. And Dr. Gansel is not only a gifted thinker, he also has a great sense of humor, and you can always find him laughing, telling jokes, and encouraging someone. And in that vein, a fun fact about Dr. Gansel that I learned a few minutes ago is that he has a secret crush on Jane Austen, to which I would respond, don't we all? So it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Gansel to the virtual stage.
Hi, it's great to be here. I'm coming from Southern California, where it was close to 80 degrees today. So moving from Connecticut out here, I have not yet managed to miss the winter weather. I'm still kind of enjoying it. What I want to talk about for the next 20-25 minutes is Christian theism and the experience of suffering. One of the most persistent topics that is raised about the reasonability of belief in God is the problem of evil, right? We can summarize this topic with a question: to what degree does the amount or the distribution or the nature of evil count as evidence against the existence of God? Now, normally the question, as posed by philosophers, deals with what we could call a generic characterization of God. God is a being who created the world, who is perfectly good, unlimited in power and knowledge. This is kind of a generic concept of God. And in addition, the problem of evil, as pursued by philosophers, normally considers evil in the abstract. It's just evil as we find it. It isn't the concrete examples of evil that we face every day. Now, these features of the philosophical discussion are more or less appropriate. There's nothing wrong with these, but I'm going to try to do something different today. The philosophical problem of evil, we can trace the dynamic of this argument in three very easy steps. First, there are observations about evil in the world. Secondly, is the argument. We make the argument that these observations don't fit with the existence of a God who was good and who has the power to prevent all evil. And then there's the conclusion that God doesn't exist, or God probably doesn't exist. But in our discussion tonight, I want to do two things that are a little bit different from this question. I don't want to focus on evil in general, but on concrete experience of suffering. There's a big difference when we're thinking about evil as a theoretical issue and when we are in the midst of suffering. So I want to talk about more the concrete experience of suffering. Everybody encounters concrete suffering in their lives, and when we're in the midst of suffering, we don't generally ask theoretical questions. We don't pose philosophical arguments. And secondly, I want to do something different. Instead of focusing on a generic concept of God, I want to focus on the details of Christian theism in particular. So my topic will explore the dynamics of how our experience of suffering can lead a person to think that perhaps God is distant or irrelevant or might not exist. But then I want to talk about the resources of Christian theism in particular, and how those resources can be brought into our experience of suffering. So first, let's think about the dynamic experience of suffering. Each person in the world experiences suffering. We experience it ourselves. We witness it in the lives of our friends and family. We see it in the world. And to be honest, we perpetrate it by our actions and sometimes by our inaction. We are deeply embroiled in suffering. And now, of course, suffering comes in degrees. On one side, there are things that we would be embarrassed to call them suffering. They're the petty annoyances of life, like we're all getting tired of wearing our masks everywhere we go. It's an annoyance, it's a hindrance. That doesn't really count as suffering. On the other end of the spectrum is what we could call horrendous suffering. And many people experience what we could call horrendous suffering. We know a lot about this. We see it around the country, we see it around the world. There are people driven from their homes in forced migration. There are wrongful imprisonments. There are people subjected to racial hatred, facing painful disease. And these are the kinds of experiences that challenge a person's own self-identity, that seems to crush or has the potential to crush a person's resilience. We don't have to experience horrendous suffering to witness it and to be troubled by it. But in between, now some of us in this room, I suspect some of you have experienced suffering that could be called horrendous. You've endured things that no human being ought to endure. But probably most of us sitting around these virtual tables have not experienced this firsthand, although we have witnessed it in the world. Now, suffering does not need to be horrendous to be significant. And most of us have experienced events that we would call significant suffering. They've shaken our well-being. They've disrupted our plans. These events maybe have destroyed or deeply damaged relationships. And so we all encounter significant suffering. And again, when we are in the midst of this, we don't normally think about philosophical arguments. The question for us is not, boy, I wonder if this is evidence against the existence of God. But the question is more like, how do I make sense of my life in the midst of these things that I suffer or that I experience, that I witness, or even in the midst of these things that I seem to be perpetrating? And this question, how do I make sense of my life in light of suffering, is a question that everyone um, bears. Everyone pursues this kind of question. Whereas the philosophical problem of evil tends to divide people into those who are atheists, those who are theists, and they press arguments back and forth. And of course, that's what keeps philosophers employed. And one of our goals, of course, is to keep philosophers employed. It's an important project. But the question of suffering and how do I make sense of my life in the midst of suffering is something that all of us face, whether you're claim to be a follower of Jesus or not, whether you're unsure, whether you're in some other faith tradition. And it's a completely different dynamic. The dynamic of the philosophical problem goes from observations to argument to conclusion. The dynamic in facing suffering is more labyrinthian. It suffering can lead us to deep disappointment and disillusionment, disorientation with our lives. Sometimes over time, we experience a tremendous fatigue in bearing certain burdens with us. People who struggle with depression or anxiety disorders often have a sense of fatigue that it's just going on so long, and we can go down this path, and the end path is that God can seem distant or irrelevant or not real at all. And so that's kind of the dynamic of suffering. It's much less of an argument. So I want to turn to some of the resources of Christian theism for thinking about, for navigating our lives in the face of suffering. But first, why focus on Christian theism as opposed to generic theism, right? Well, to be honest, most people are not generic theists. Most people who believe in God don't believe only in a being who is the creator, is powerful, good, and knowledgeable. Most people who believe in God are embedded in a religious faith tradition of one kind or another, which includes a lot more information than just the bare attributes of God that philosophers often talk about. And this is true of normal people, and it's true of philosophers. So philosophers often divide the world into philosophers and normal people because we're trying to understand what it is to be normal, I suppose. And so most philosophers or other scholars who are believers in God are Christian theists, Islamic theists, Jewish theists, some other kind of tradition. Most of us are embedded in a tradition. So it is worthwhile to explore the resources of these traditions. And one thing we're going to find is that generic theism doesn't tell us a lot about the resources or doesn't provide a lot of resources to help us navigate our lives in light of suffering. But particular religious traditions do. And I'm focusing on Christian theism because it has some unique elements that others don't have. And it's also the tradition that I hold. It's the one I think is true. So the way we're going to explore the resources of Christian theism is first I'm going to take a few minutes and talk about the arc of history in the Christian story. Kind of what's the big picture of Christianity? And most of this will be familiar to many of you, and some of it won't be. But it's helpful to get the big picture of what the Christian story is before we start pinpointing those things it can bring to the question of experiencing suffering. So the arc of history in the Christian story has 5 acts, right? I'm not assuming that you think any of this is true, but I'm just going to lay out the acts. It's important to grasp the arc in order to think well about Christianity and suffering. Now, some of the points here are shared by other religious traditions. Some are unique to Christianity. The first act is creation, that God created the world. Most theistic religions hold that God created the world in some sense. And God created the world in the Christian story for reasons. He had reasons of his own for creating the world and creating it the way that he did. So the first act is creation. Some of the reasons that God created can be found in the Christian story, are revealed. They're explained in the Christian story. If you go back to the first book of the Old Testament, Genesis, we read in chapter 1 that God created human beings in his image. So the text says this. I'll just read this for illustration. So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish of the sea and the birds in the sky and over every living creature that moves on the ground. Now, this blessing that God gives to human beings has been taken by theologians, and I think rightly so, to be the mandate to create culture. The task of human beings on this earth is to continue God's creative process in the world by cultivating the good world that God has created. So our task is to bring good and true and beautiful and useful things out of this good world. And that includes all of culture. And this is why in the theistic traditions that are rooted in the book of Genesis, there's always been a high view of culture and a deep value of the arts and a deep value of learning, because our task is to cultivate and enjoy the world. So the first act is creation. The second act is what we could call rebellion. And this happens also in the book of Genesis. Human beings rebelled against God's authority. And a result of this is that we disrupt our relation to God. And this is what the theologians call sin, right? We sin, we walk away from the dependence relationship with God that we were supposed to have, that we were created to have. And a result of our walking away is a disruption of all of our relationships. Our relationship to God is disrupted because we've rebelled against him. Our relationship even to ourselves is disrupted because we tend to have evasive strategies to deal with our guilt and the evil we perpetrate. We don't admit to ourselves the things that we are and the things that we do. Our relationship to each other is disrupted. I mean, the first thing that in the Adam and Eve story they do once they sin is they blame each other. They blame each other for the whole story. So that relationship is disrupted. And also our relationship to the created world is distorted and twisted. So in our rebellion against God, it affects every aspect of what it means to be made in his image, including our capacities, including our task of creating culture, of cultivating the world. So first we have creation, then rebellion. And then there are two stages that are closely related. And this is when God comes to earth in the person of Jesus, right? So the Christian story is that in order to overcome human rebellion, God himself became human in the historical person of Jesus. And the theologians call this the incarnation. And he demonstrated what it means to be a human being. He lived a fully human life. Jesus was fully God and fully human. Because he's fully God, he lived a perfect life. Because he's fully human, he takes up every human concern. The second part of God coming to earth in Jesus is his death and resurrection, that Jesus died to pay the penalty for our rebellion against God. And so these relationships can be restored and forgiveness is available for our rebellion against God. And so Jesus dies the death to pay for our rebellion, and then he's raised physically from the dead, which has lots of implications, one of which is that death is conquered. Another is that he has fully paid the penalty for our rebellion. So the third and fourth act are closely related. God came to earth in Jesus. And then the fifth act is that God completes his plan of redemption and restoration. So we could say it this way: God defeated evil and suffering at its root in the death of Jesus to provide forgiveness and restoration. But God will defeat evil and suffering in its entirety when God enters history again to bring justice to the world. And so that's the arc. That's kind of the big historical story of what Christianity says reality is like. So let's bring this theme into our experience of suffering. What does Christian theism bring to our experience of suffering? I'm going to mention 6 specific contributions that Christian theism brings. And some of them are a little bit connected to the philosophical problem of evil, and others are connected to our experience of suffering. First, if there is not a lot of evil, if there were not a lot of evil, a lot of horrible evil, we would know that Christianity is false. Christianity requires there to be lots of evil in the world if it's going to be true, because it's a story of God's acts to redeem us from horrible evil. In fact, the sacrifice of Jesus in his death and his separation from the Father, it shows that the evil has to be significant. It has to be horrible. And so there's a kind of irony here, because evil is usually taken as an evidence against what we call generic theism. But if there was no evil, we would have a proof that Christianity is false. Christianity requires evil because it's a story of redemption from evil. So that helps us see that evil and suffering are actually part of the Christian story. Secondly, the Christian story is a story about a God who suffers and who enters our suffering. It's a story of a God who is not distant. God is not distant. He enters the broken world in Christ, and then he takes on himself the cause of our suffering, which is our rebellion against God. Of all the major religious traditions, Christian theism has the most deep involvement of God in the sufferings of human beings. Um, Jesus demonstrated God's involvement in suffering as he walked through life, and he touched lepers, and he ate with outcasts, and he healed the unclean. And then he taught his followers to do the same. Right? So he modeled this, entering the suffering of others to lift their burdens. So third, Christianity, the Christian story can help us navigate our lives in the midst of suffering here and now. So when we come to faith in Christ, when a person becomes a Christ follower, um, God gives us his Spirit who indwells us. And we have the presence of God in our lives in real and dynamic ways. And there's a sense in which many times in the midst of our suffering, we feel alone. But the Christian story is we're not alone, because the Spirit of God dwells in us. There's the presence of the God who cares for us. He brings assurance and comfort in the midst of our pain. He also brings strength and endurance in times of suffering. There's a sentence in the New Testament about the results of God's work in our lives. And the writer says this: the fruit of the Spirit, and that's allowing God through his Spirit to direct our lives. The fruit is love, joy, peace, forbearance, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. And in the context of suffering, forbearance is the one that is most pertinent. Right? We need the power to endure when we have suffering. And this is a promised gift of God as we cooperate with him in the development of our character. Right? And that leads us to the fourth one, which is in the Christian story, God redeems our suffering and uses it to shape us into the kind of people who are, to be honest, more fully human. Part of God's work in human beings in the Christian story is to restore the humanity that's damaged in our rebellion. And part of what God does is he uses certain experiences of suffering to help build our moral character and our you could say maybe social virtue. We learn to be empathetic through what we suffer. We learn to be caring through the challenges that we have. One of the early Christian writers said this, and it's in the book of James. So this guy's name was presumably James. Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. So when you encounter trials, it's the trials that produce perseverance. Right? We would never learn patience unless we had challenges. We would never learn to persevere unless there were trials we had to overcome. And this is some of the reason that God allows various forms of suffering in our lives. It's often a tool for growth, for our character, and for our virtue. So the fifth thing that Christian theism brings to the challenge of suffering is that in Christian theism we have a role in pushing back evil. So remember the mandate to build culture. We were to be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth. In other words, spread the cultivation of the garden throughout the whole earth, which is cultivating, which is culture. Um, and in our rebellion, that mandate was not rescinded. It's still what it means to be human, is to be a culture maker. And the difference is now that evil and suffering are in the world, we don't simply bring good things out of the world, but we have to roll back the effects of evil in order to bring good things out of the world. And that's part of our mandate. That's part of what it means to be a human being. And so Christianity gives us a role in pushing back evil and bringing good out of this good world. And this basic framework is what shapes all of Christian ethics throughout the New Testament. Right? That we love one another. We love our neighbor as ourselves. We lay down our lives for each other. We're rolling back the evil and the suffering in people's lives to the degree that we can. There are lots of models of this throughout the New Testament, both in the stories that Jesus told and in the way he interacted with people. So we have a role in pushing back evil and suffering. And then lastly, Christianity gives us hope that evil can be and will be defeated. And this is the final arc in the history when God enters the world to bring justice. Is there any hope? This is a question that's crucial when we're facing suffering. It's a question I think that's crucial for your generation. It's important for my generation. And the issue is what gives us hope in the face of evil and suffering in the world. The Christian story brings hope in two ways. We have hope now because God is already at work rolling back the effects of evil and rebellion. We can make a real difference in the lives of others as we serve them. But the Christian story gives us hope in another way as well. It's not simply that we can help other people, but in the end, it's all going to be washed away. We have hope that evil and suffering will be completely overcome because God is a God of justice, and he will bring justice to the world. Towards the very end of the Bible, in the last chapter, there's a vision. The writer of the book of Revelation has this vision, and he says, I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride, beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them. This is a reference to our relation with God being ruptured by our rebellion. They will be his people, and God himself will be with him and be their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and there will be no more death, or mourning, or crying, or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. He who was seated on the throne said, I am making everything new. So God's plan to redeem the world from evil will be accomplished. Now, we are some of the main agents of pushing back the effects of suffering and bringing hope and lifting people. But in the end, God will accomplish this entirely. Evil and suffering will be gone. People will be restored. There'll be no more exploitation, no more pornography, no more trafficking, no more racial injustice. All of these things will be obliterated, and no one will get away with it, any of these things. So these are some of the resources that Christian theism brings to navigating suffering. I know I kind of gave you a shotgun approach, both with the Christian story and with a couple of thoughts, these 6 ways the Christian story connects with suffering. The challenge of suffering for us is that it disrupts our equilibrium, and it can disrupt our thoughts about God. And I think Christian theism has the resources to meet us in the midst of our suffering, and then to help us turn and be change agents in the world. The Christian story reveals that God is not distant. He is active in and through the people he created as we go forward to roll back evil and to serve one another. Thank you so much. I'll be anxious to hear your questions.
Thank you so much, Greg. I really like the way that you laid out those points in your talk. That was super great. Really appreciate it. So as mentioned earlier, now we're going to be moving into a time of Q&A. I'm going to be reading the questions to Dr. Gansel from the Q&A section in the descending order of upvotes. So everyone, please take a moment to read through the questions, upvote your favorite ones, the ones you want to hear answered, and then also feel free to add new ones as we go along. And as a reminder, please just make sure not to have duplicates. Look at the questions first before adding, just so we don't have any doubles, and then vote on the question that's similar to yours instead. So I think we will start with this one at the top, which seems to have votes, and that is, how about no suffering and no redemption or growth? So redemption and growth seems like a solution for which a problem has been specifically created. No.
Okay, if I understand the question, I think you're getting at, can't we have the benefits of redemption and growth without suffering? And the answer is yes and no. There are certain benefits we can have without suffering, but others we simply can't. You cannot develop perseverance without challenges. You cannot develop patience without challenges. There are certain virtues that are tied to these kinds of challenges, and these virtues are good things. So the fact that God uses suffering to build our virtue, that's not the only reason. That doesn't cover every aspect of suffering, but it's one of the threads that suffering becomes our opportunity for a response to allow the virtue or character to be built so that we can serve others better. I mean, that's the short answer. People might want to follow up on that a little bit.
Yeah, thanks. I think the question right after that actually does follow up a bit on that. So the question is, if suffering builds character, as you mentioned, why do some people experience far less suffering than others? And wouldn't a universally granted constant stream of suffering build even better character for everyone?
Yes. Yeah. And this again it's a good question. It's related to the question or the issue that there are lots of things that feature into the causes of suffering, and people do experience different suffering. Much suffering that people experience is inflicted by other people, and it's inflicted non-equitably, right? And so many of the ills of the world, um, and so so if the only purpose for suffering was to build character, then we might expect what is phrased here as a universally granted constant stream of suffering, or maybe an equitable distribution of suffering. But um, there are other reasons that play in terms of the existence of suffering. The issue here is that one of the things that God is interested in is what can come out of suffering. Given that there is suffering, what can He bring out of it?
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a good response. I think the
Mhm.
question below that also is a tough question, so I'm gonna ask it. I think
Sure.
the question is sort of, why is there this indefinite delay in bringing justice to the world and resolving suffering? As you said in one of your points, that Christianity, because we know that will eventually come and resolve all the suffering. But this question is, why is there this delay? Why did he just
Yeah.
hang around and do it right then as soon as he resurrected?
Well, I'm not sure I know the whole answer to that story. There are some hints in the New Testament that God is interested in bringing the fullness of His people into relationship with Him. And of course, if Jesus had completed the task back in 30 A.D., we wouldn't be part of it, right? Because it would be all done. And so we can do some speculating. I think one of the issues about God's intervention to bring complete justice is that um, my perpetrating of suffering is going to be under the scrutiny of God. It's not just that God is going to reverse the perpetration of suffering of other people. It's going to be all of us, right? And the delay, although I don't think it's indefinite, the delay, it says in the New Testament, gives us a chance to repent and to turn to Him for forgiveness and to cast ourselves on His mercy. And that's how the forgiveness made available by Christ on the cross is applicable to us. So there's a kind of a mercy in the delay to give more people a chance to respond. Um, but there's probably other reasons that we don't know anything about, which of course makes sense if it's God's thoughts we're talking about.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a great answer to that question.
Yeah,
Very difficult, but and thank you for asking the question as well, whoever does that.
sure.
So I think the next question here is that has the most votes right now is, isn't it also true that suffering leads to more suffering rather than redemption? And this begins some kind of cycle of violence,
Yeah.
and why allow it to start in the first place?
Yes, it's often the case that suffering leads to more suffering, right? And this is a function, I think, of the fundamental orientation of the human heart, which is in rebellion against God. And one theologian writes that we have this characteristic propensity to hide and to hurl. In other words, we hide our true selves from God and from others. and from ourselves, and then we hurl. And in the Genesis story, the hurling was a blaming kind of thing, but it becomes a perpetration in many cases of violence. And then when violence is perpetrated, um, the response is often to accentuate the violence, and but that's the wrong response, right? There have been some stunning examples of people suffering violence and not retaliating to try to break the chain of violence. Um, so it's just empirically true that oftentimes suffering produces other suffering, um, and but there are many reasons for that, right? Because of sometimes it's choices, sometimes it's systemic problems. I mean, the effects of our rebellion are very complicated, and they get into what sometimes people call systemic injustice, systemic sin. Institutions are framed around policies that might look benign, but are actually perpetrate suffering, um, and sometimes it's hard for an individual person to know how to unravel that.
Yeah, thank you. I think this next question gets at sort of this idea of suffering being beneficial and sort of a counterexample to that. But this person says, I know lots of students who grew up believing in God, but then because of immense suffering in their lives, end up turning away from God. How is that productive in bringing more people to his kingdom?
Um, uh, this is a great question. I think it's a common thing, and I was trying to trace very briefly and almost simplistically the dynamics of how that happens, where eventually we just begin to feel like God is distant, God is uncaring, and or it's just not worth it to be a follower of Christ. Um, and this is something that happens to lots of people. This in itself is not productive to bringing more people into his kingdom. So what I was trying to unpack is if we understand the Christian story a little more accurately, then we can say, no, wait a minute, God is not distant. I might feel that God is distant, but my feelings about the nature of God's relation to me don't always determine reality. And if a person can cling to the reality that God is present, God is caring, God wants to pull and bring good out of suffering and then help us be agents of change in the world, then it doesn't make the suffering less, but it can stop the progression that seems to some people inevitable to the conclusion that God is distant, God doesn't care. The Christian story is a God who is deeply involved in the suffering, alleviating the suffering of the world. Very good question.
No, yeah, thank you for answering that. Because it actually answered a question I was going to ask you, just sort of going off of
Mm-hmm.
that, which is like you had advice for someone who maybe feels who's in that situation, who's in that place where they just really feel like they're in the midst of suffering and that they distant
Mm-hmm.
from God, whether you're a Christian or not.
Right, right.
Any other points of advice that you think would, tell that person, other
Mm-hmm.
than just to sort of feel like to remind themselves that God is close?
Yeah, I think well, in the Christian framework, I would encourage someone to continue. This is kind of an in-house discussion now for people who are Christians, to continue to pursue what we sometimes call the spiritual disciplines, to continue to pray, to continue to read the scriptures. Someone in the course of suffering, I would strongly encourage to read the Psalms of Lament, where the psalmist is crying out in his or her suffering, and to read those and to pray those to God. And for I think a lot of people feel like that you can't complain to God because it's inappropriate. But the scripture tells a very different story, that the Psalms of lament are complaints to God. Say, God, how long will you forsake me? But so often, by the end of the poem, by the end of the psalm, the psalmist has seen a change in perspective as he's meditated on God and even cried out to God. So there are some spiritual practices that I would encourage someone to continue, even if she feels that God is distant in the midst of something that's difficult. That's one track to go on.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
great. And I mean, we can say that we could apply those to people who also maybe aren't Christians but are interested in encountering God in the middle of suffering. I feel like those Psalms of Lament really can speak to people in general,
Yes.
just to know that like there were people who felt
Mm-hmm.
the way that you did and who felt distant from God
Yeah.
even being Christian.
Yes, and I would say even, the Psalms of Lament is one way to go, but just you can also cry out to God without the Psalms and just say, look, if God, if you're real, your ego can take it when I complain, right? I'm not going to hurt your feelings. What is going on here? Give me some sense that this life of mine is not meaningless. And I think that kind of raw, honest prayer by people wherever they are in the spiritual spectrum can be um, will be answered. There'll be you may find a sense that, okay, I can see through this a little bit. Yeah.
Great, thank you for that answer. I think the next question sort of you addressed it a little bit at the beginning, but sort of gets at the
Mhm.
definition of suffering. What does suffering really mean at its core?
Yeah. Well, it could be a hard question, right? The same thing with evil, right? How do you characterize evil? And so I'm going to start with that. Um, the best characterization, not necessarily definition, but characterization of evil that I've heard is something is evil when it should not be that way. And of course, evil comes in degrees. There are minor evils, like it shouldn't be that I can't find a parking space. We might not call that evil, but it's annoying. Um, but if there's a deep sense that it really shouldn't be this way, that's at least a mark of evil. And then building on that, I usually talk about suffering in terms of experiencing an event that impinges on my life, and it shouldn't be that way. Because I can think about evil in a very abstract sense. I can think about, yeah, well, there's evil in the world, right? Or I can think about evils that are far away that don't really touch my psyche, so to speak. But when something impinges on me, either because it's me or someone I know, or something that's brought before me, then there's this experiential part of it. So I guess I would characterize suffering as an experienced state or thing or event that ought not be that way. Um, and generally hurtful. Yeah.
Great.
I don't know if
No,
that's
thank
helpful.
you. I think it's a very complete definition of it.
Yeah.
So the question below that says, at its core, if one is to create beings with the ability to think freely, how automatically does it require them to have sufficient knowledge to choose between good and evil? So I think the question is just, why does God expect human beings to be able to choose between good and evil if he created them?
Yeah. Well, this raises a whole bunch of interesting questions, and I think there are a lot of different views on the nature of free will. I think God did create us with significant freedom. Um, in other words, things we do, not necessarily everything, but many of the things we choose to do are really up to us, and God did not determine that we do them. Now, God could determine that we do something, but we wouldn't be free. And we really do have this kind of freedom. But the second part of the question about knowledge, I think, is connected not so much to freedom as to moral responsibility. At least I hope it is, because it's a really good insight. In order for me to be morally responsible for a choice that I make, I think philosophers disagree, and I think not only does it have to be up to me, the choice, but I have to have sufficient knowledge, and I like the phrase sufficient knowledge in the question, to discern the moral landscape of the choice. So if I'm choosing between vanilla ice cream and butter pecan, which I never do because I always have butter pecan at an ice cream shop, that seems like a free choice. But I'm not morally responsible if there's a terrorist in the back of the shop who says, I'm going to kill you all when somebody orders butter pecan ice cream, and I don't know anything about it. I just choose butter pecan. One of the effects is that all these people die. Well, I'm not morally responsible. So I need to have sufficient knowledge to be morally responsible. Now, I can be free in a choice where I don't have sufficient knowledge to sort out the moral terrain, but I wouldn't hold people morally responsible for that. So that's kind of the framework I would use for a question like that. It's a good question.
Oh, yeah, thank you for that answer. I think that was a very complete answer. This question is a little bit further down, but I think it's something that is important because it gets at something you mentioned earlier, which is if evil is characterized as something that should not be that way, then how would one define evil outside of a Christian framework in which there is no definition of how things should be?
Well, that's an excellent question. And I think that's the rub. The philosopher who put forward this, at least who I heard this characterization from, is a Christian, and he went around and asked his friends who are atheist philosophers how to characterize evil, and many of them had no characterization at all, and others thought his characterization was pretty good, but his name's Doug Guyvid. He's in our department here. But what Doug has gone on to say is it's very hard to give a good characterization of evil that doesn't at least fit better with the reality of God, that there is a way things should be, and that's objective. Now, there's an atheist philosopher whose name I can't remember now, but in his essay, there's a book called Debating Christian Theism. It's a whole anthology. He also characterizes evil this way, and I think it's just in a footnote. I remember the footnote. I can't remember the guy's name. I'm sorry about that, but I think if someone is not happy with that characterization, that's fine, but it would be good to get one and say, okay, well, you tell me your best characterization of evil, and it is pretty hard to get one that at least does not. I don't want to say it implies that God exists, but it at least fits better with the view that there is a way things should be, and this is objective, so there is teleology or purpose in the universe. I think it's a pretty strong consideration.
Oh, great. Thank you for those points. I think that answers a lot of questions that other people were having in the chat just about, does a worldview based around atheism have sufficient moral framework to determine if evil actually exists?
Yeah, I can say a few things about that. Now, many Christian philosophers are going to say something like, without God, you can't really distinguish between good and evil. And I actually don't think that's true. Okay, I think you can have, I think there are consistent atheistic stories or theories about moral goodness. One example would be utilitarianism, most famous by John Stuart Mill, where the morally right action is the action that produces the most pleasure and the least pain, counting everybody the same. And well, the characterization of evil is pain there, and there are objective facts about pain and suffering, and I think that's not an entirely inadequate analysis of moral goodness. I think it's much harder to get a good theory of moral obligation without God. So it could be a fact that it's morally good to prevent pain, but how do you get from there to the conclusion that I am obligated to prevent pain rather than cause pain? That's where I think the atheistic theories are weaker.
Yeah, that's a great the point about
Okay.
obligation. Thanks for bringing that. So I think some of the next questions here, a lot of the questions are sort of relating to this idea of suffering and growth. And so this question asks, do we need to suffer to grow? And is suffering the only way we can grow as people?
Boy, that's a hard question. I think it's a good question. I think it's not that every element of growth has to come out of suffering, but I think in most situations, or for most people, at some times, we need something to rattle us out of our complacency. Growth doesn't happen when I binge Netflix, right? It's I'm being complacent, and to be honest, I do a lot of that, right? I'm not really going to grow unless something rattles me out of my complacency, and suffering is one of the primary ways we get rattled. It's like, wait a minute, what's going on here? And then we begin to pay attention. Most of us don't pay attention to our lives on a daily basis. We live them, but we aren't really deeply reflective about them. And sometimes it takes something to rattle us. So I would not say that we need to suffer to grow, but it's one of the primary ways that we can begin to reflect deeply about our lives. It can stimulate that the way other things don't.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I definitely know, like, even, the little sufferings in my life have been the moments where I'm like, oh, I haven't been reflecting on this part of my life enough. So I think, the idea of reflection and how suffering brings that about is really important. This question has been at the top for a while, but it's, will no one build character anymore in the new creation after Jesus returns and there is no more suffering?
Well, that's also a great question. I think the way we build character will be different because our rebellion against God will be overcome. We'll have a complete restoration of our spiritual relationship to God. We won't need suffering to grow. But I have to footnote and say I'm completely speculating here because I don't know that much about. There isn't that much told, but I think that it's important that in the new creation, we will continue to be human. In fact, we'll be more fully human there than we are now, and we will continue to have. I think we'll continue to have work and cultivation and relationships, and these are going to be opportunities for growth. We won't have the need to push back the effects of evil like we do in this life. So it'll be kind of a different dynamic in terms of our growth. So I guess my short answer is I think we will build character, but we'll be able to do that because our rebellion will have been overcome.
Yeah, I think that's a great response. Thank you so much. So this question is a little bit more personal, but do you have any stories you can share about how you or close friends or relatives suffered and how your or their relationship with God and the Christian theology in general helped pull them through it?
Yes, yeah. I mean, I have stories Um, I'm trying to
No, yeah,
focus on
definitely
one.
take.
Um, my I mean, so we have a faculty discussion group out here, and one of the and it's 7 couples, and we get together and presumably discuss, but mostly we chit chat and pray for each other. And one of the couples, he's a psychologist, and he had stage 3 colon cancer this past year, and endured um, everything that goes with that, right? Chemo, radiation, surgery, possibly being on a colostomy bag his whole life, but that looks like it's going to be fixed, and so it's been a year or more for his name's Chris Grace for Chris, and Chris and Elisa have really drawn strength from their relationship with God. It's been inspiring for us, even while they're very open about the struggles and about the pain. So that's one example uh, around us. And when before I met my wife Jeannie, she had a cornea transplant, and while she was waiting for this cornea transplant, because she had a herpes simplex virus that scarred her eye, um, she kept praying that God would heal her, and she didn't understand it because she thought, boy, if you really healed me, then my family would notice. And one day this thought occurred to her, whether it was a prompting of God or not. She thinks it is. And the thought was, if I healed you, your family would say, isn't modern medicine wonderful? But if you endure and walk through this with joy, then they're going to notice, right? And so for her, that gave her the sense, okay, it's time to walk through this and with joy. I mean, that's a little story. A cornea transplant, it's not like cancer. Um, so there are examples um, all around. Um, and when we're in significant suffering, it's important that we can be honest. And there are going to be days when God is going to seem distant, and that's okay. We just be honest. We don't pretend like we are doing better than we are.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a great answer. I just know, like, yeah, personally, stories of suffering of always. There's a lot of examples of, as was mentioned in the Q&A, times when you feel really distant from God, and people who lose their faith,
Mm-hmm.
but also examples of people who grow a lot stronger in their faith and closer to God. Yeah, for
Mm-hmm.
sharing.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we have time for one more
Yeah.
question, but I was just wanted to ask. How would you address the role of the church in causing suffering throughout history? I think this is something that comes up a lot for people
Mm-hmm.
who hear the point about how I think you even brought this up in your talk. We as Christians are called to to bring to, like, resolve the suffering that we see in the world, and yet the church
Yeah.
has caused suffering throughout history, and Christians continue to do so. How would you address someone who brings up this?
Well, I mean, that's a very complicated question. There are some obvious things, like, yes, the Christian body, the church, broadly speaking, has caused a lot of suffering, right? And it's also alleviated a lot of suffering, right? And in our current cultural climate, people are much more. There's much more recognition of how the church caused suffering than alleviated suffering. But it's just literally true. Now, why is that the case? Well, because we're all rebellious against God, right? The church is evil because people are evil. The church is rebellious because people are rebellious, and our progress towards restoration is gradual and slow and hampered, and so it gets to be very complicated. I mean, I would say this, that I don't know, there's a year, and I don't know what the year is, so I'm going to pretend it's 1900, although it was probably like 1920. Before that year, nobody in the world built a hospital that wasn't in their own hometown except Christians, right? It's been the church that has brought hospitals and schools and literacy, and one of the battles that's going on today that is almost unrecognized is there are many tribes of people, very small, that have their own language and their whole language and culture is threatened. And it's the Bible translators who go in and preserve the language and record it and get it written down. So I mean, the motivation is so these people can hear the word of God in their own heart language. But what happens along the way is these languages and cultures get preserved, and otherwise they can die out in a generation. I mean, that's just a small thing. So yeah, there's a lot of pain that the church did. But, you could say that in the 20th century, more people were killed by their own governments in honor of philosophies that were conscious rejections of God than died in all the wars before that. I mean, so human beings have a bad track record. That includes the church. What's extraordinary is how much good the church has done, I think.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much for that answer. And that's probably also a bit of a preview of a speaker who's going to be speaking later in this series on morality and religion. So that was great. So yeah, thank you so much for all of these thoughtful answers. And I know we still have a few unanswered questions in the chat. So our speaker will immediately be following this at a table to continue the discussion with anyone who's interested. And we also have our speaker, Dr. Tom Rodelius from the last week, who's also here, who will be at a table, or not the last week, sorry, this past Tuesday. Will also be at a table to answer any questions you have. So there should be a table called Science and Faith. And then there'll be also a table for just general Q&A. We have some members of the crew staff there who would be happy to answer questions if you have any questions about Christianity in general. So you also can feel free to just stay at your table if you were with people you know, and just we're going to leave the room open for a while. So feel free to do that too. And we're always trying to improve the Reason for God series, and we'd love to have your feedback on tonight. So please follow the link in the chat to a Google form. One thing we're offering for free are some outstanding books that are really great at exploring some of the big questions about God and Christianity. Maybe some questions that you had tonight could be answered by some of these books. So if you would like a copy, you can pick a book in the feedback form and we will send it to you. And just to note, this is only an offer to students. So if students only would fill this out, that would be great. And some of the books that we're offering include The Reason for God by Tim Keller, after which this series is named, and Confronting Christianity by Dr. Rebecca McLaughlin, who will be speaking later in this series. And then another is called How to Be an Atheist, Why Many Skeptics Aren't Skeptical Enough. And we are also offering the book that Dr. Gansel wrote tonight, which is called Our Deepest Desires, How the Christian Story Fulfills Human Aspirations. If you wanted to give a quick summary very briefly about that book, we would love that.
Well, in that book, I'm not arguing that Christianity is true. I'm trying to build a case that deep down we want it to be true, because deep, persistent human aspirations and desires are actually fit really well within the Christian story. So I talk about the arc of the Christian story, and then I talk about there's a section on people. Why do we value persons, goodness, beauty, and freedom? And so it's kind of a conversational book. It doesn't assume that the reader is a Christian or wants to be, but it's a good conversational book. At least I think it is. I was happy.
Great. Yeah, if you're interested in that book, please make sure to fill out the form and request it. And our next talk on Tuesday, January 19th, will be Dr. Paul Gould, and the topic for that is The Search for Meaning in a Disenchanted World. So if you are interested in joining for that, we're going to have a different link. So make sure to check our website, reasoningforgod.com, for the details on that. Feel free to invite your friends to join. And we really hope to see you guys there for our next talk. And we're very glad you were able to join us for this one. So again, please join the table after we close this window if you'd like to stick around and talk to the speaker or some other people here who can help process some of the questions that you want to talk about. And thank you all again for being here.
Thanks, Carolina.